H dropping. Wherever you have an H sound in C pronunciation, you can just not have it. And that's what you get in common. So instead of a hammer to hit things with, you have a hammer to hit things with. Or indeed an hammer to hit things with. And it means that edge and edge pronounced identically, arm and arm pronounced identically, hearty and arty pronounced identically. Dickens, in his representations of Cockney, you probably know some of you, shows Londoners as using hypercorrect H's and saying things like a Easter egg instead of an Easter egg. Now, I think this is no longer true. At least it's not widespread, though you do get it in some other parts of the country. Okay, so dropping H is one very familiar thing for the Cockney. TH fronting, the dental fricatives. These are difficult sounds, as many of you know. And what happens in Cockney is they get switched to other things. Most commonly they get switched to the corresponding leguidentals. So instead of we get F. So for I think we get I think. Instead of 33, we get 33. 33. Just try saying it that way, 33. If you can try doing it with a glottal stop as well. You 33. 33. 33. An E rather than E at the end. 33. 33. 33. The corresponding voice can become the. So rather than have a mother and father, you have a mother and father. Mother and father. Try that, mother and father.
Mother and father.
Mother and father. Yes. Seeing as there are now millions of English speakers who do that, one has to ask, is it worthwhile going on insisting to foreign learners that they should learn to do it properly? Also, notice that in initial position, we get a plosive. So instead of this and that, you don't usually get this and that from Londoners, you get this and that. This and that with an D. So it depends on the position. This, that, then, those. In some contexts, you get other things. After and, for example, you get just a lengthening of the N. So and this, standard and this, becomes and this, and this. And that is and that. So you get, for this and that, you get this nat, or this nat, this nat. After L, you may get an L, so all this for all this, all that for all that. In the flow of speech, it's very easy not to hear it. Other things Cockneys do are weaken unstressed O to So rather than have a window to look out of, you have a window. Window. Again, you may have come across this in Dickens. Anybody who read Nicholas Nickleby, where the headmaster of Do the Boys All sets the boys a spelling test, and the word they have to spell is window. And when they don't know, he spells it for them, W-I-N-D-E-R. In other words, he's so uneducated himself that he pronounces it winder, and he thinks it's spelt that way. So it's a complicated kind of joke. And then he has a bit of practical exercise for the class. They have to go and clean the windows. Spell it. Okay, this means that pillow and pillar can become identical for Londoners. Pillar, both pronounced the same. You get hypercorrection when people learn it's better to say window rather than window. They tend to say pillow, not only for the thing they sleep, they put their head on when they sleep, but also for the column. By hypercorrection. You, weak form y. Now, we're very careful about teaching you weak forms of you. We tend to tell you to say you. That's the safe one. Because y is socially different from you. If I say goodbye by saying see you, that's the RP version. If I say it in Cockney, see ya, and there's a wealth of social meaning in the difference between see ya and see ya. Same thing applies with to. In the final position, we tell you to use who. I'm not sure if I can, but I'll try to. In London, yeah, I'll try that. What's the time? 10 to. 10 to. 10 to instead. Okay, now those are all things that are good copy. The rest of the things we can look at now are estuary English. They're part of the way things are going. And if people are writing suggesting that estuary English is going to continue its march and is due to displace received pronunciation in a few years, well, this is what you must note as the way things are moving. It's clear that historically speaking, estuary English has all of the historical innovations of received pronunciation plus some more. Let's look at these things. Well, the first one, 4.2.1, is in fact a bit socially sensitive. This is the way of pronouncing the ing ending, where instead of using a velar nasal, ing, running, you use an alveolar nasal. So you say running, morning, feeding, or perhaps feeding, let's do that again. Ceiling, wedding for wedding, pudding for pudding. Running and standing still. This is, in fact, socially sensitive virtually throughout the English-speaking world. Because for us, this is so full of social and stylistic meaning. And it's therefore very important, socially, as a speaker of English, to be alert to this distinction between different kinds of nasal. What makes things slightly more complicated is that historically there used to be, and perhaps there still is, I don't know, an aristocratic use of the alveolar nasal. So that we read stories of King George V and one of his courtiers who appeared in a very noisy, as we say, very loud jacket, a jacket with a very crude pattern on it, which was felt to be inappropriate in court. And so the king said to him, "Morning, Harris, going ratting." Are you going ratting, going to catch rats, wearing such unusual clothes? And this is reported to us with apostrophe N, going, apostrophe, instead of going. Morning, Harris, going ratting, 3 times. And that was meant to be the king's pronunciation. Well, unfortunately, I'm not really on chatting terms with any royalty or any members of the aristocracy that, from my observations of them on television and so on, they don't do it nowadays. So I think that's part of history. But that's why this is a slightly more complicated matter socially. Now let's move on to some more interesting things. L vocalization. You've been taught all about dark ale, haven't you? Milk. Rather complicated articulation. If you do everything for a dark ale, except you don't move your tongue tip, you're left with a back vocoid, a back vowel. Ooh. This is a rather odd sound. Ooh. If you round your lips, ooh, you end up with a fairly familiar kind of sound. And this is what's happening in London. So instead of milk, people are saying milk, 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 milk. So we might transcribe it like that. Milk, milk. Using an O, the second half of a diphthong, a new diphthong, milk, milk. Just try saying milk, 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 and then do the same at the end of bottle, giving you bottle, 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 and you've got milk bottle. Milk bottle, milk bottle, milk bottle. Shelf becomes shelf, shelf. Middle becomes middle, middle, middle. Notice you don't have lateral release anymore in middle because you don't have a lateral. You get this vowel, middle, 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 middle. This seems to be spreading very fast. And I quite often have students, native English students, who really don't have dark L in their repertoire of sounds. So they use all instead. And again, I have to ask, with millions of English people now saying all instead of all, do we really have to go on teaching that then to everybody? I think there's no harm in trying, but if people can't do it, then this is the obvious way out. Much better to say middle than to say middle, or something else that sounds very unnative. Nobody will notice it at all. In fact, Gibson in his book 1962 already comments that it's beginning to be heard in received pronunciation, at least adjacent to labels. Gives examples like myself in the table. And if it was already heard in RP in 1962, well, it's obviously much more established by now. And people like me who don't use it are going to gradually seem old-fashioned. T glottal. Glottal stop. Now, glottal stop, so it's kind of closely made, antiglottic instead of with the tongue tip. Instead of ta 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 ta, you have Just try doing that. Okay. And I'm sure we've already told you, Dr. Boyd or somebody has told you, that in many syllable final environments, it's now frequently heard in received pronunciation. So in a word like football, that we've got here, football, it really now passes unnoticed. And it's beginning to sound rather careful to say football with an alveolar T. Football. One of the people in the phone I was on the other day was complaining about people using the pronunciation network. Now, I knew what she was on about. She was commenting on the glottal stop. Network, and she prefers network, the older pronunciation. But the other people discussing it, this is the interesting point, who weren't phoneticians, couldn't understand what she was complaining about. They didn't see that there was any difference. They just said it again, network, network, network. They said it one way or the other, and really just were not sensitive to any such difference. So we equate these two things. Tongue-tip T, network, glottal T, network. People are no longer sensitive to the difference, and the glottal one is becoming general. That's why London's second airport is now increasingly referred to as Gatwick Airport. Try saying it that way, Gatwick. Gatwick. Just don't use your tongue tip. Gatwick. What happens in estuary English is that the range of positions in which this is used is wider. In particular, we get it not only before a consonant like Gatwick, Scotland, network and so on, but also before a vowel. So rather than get out, you would have get out, get out, get out. Now, in my kind of English, that's really not possible. But this is clearly the way things are going. Take it away becomes take it away. Take it away. Try that and take it away. Take it away. Take it away. In fact, the word it is really much more frequently pronounced it than it. You take it off, put it away. In really broad Cockney, you get this even for a T within a word. And so we've got the example on the handout of city, which in Cockney can be pronounced city. City. Now this isn't really quite, I think, possible in estuary English, depends how you find it. My educated undergraduates, English students, unless they're trying to make a demonstration of their working class roots or something like that, wouldn't on the whole do this. They won't say city, but they will say take it off. Other examples are water, yes, water. Glottal stop is not the same as nothing. You're not leaving it out. It's often described as omitting it, but it really isn't. And there is a difference between network and network. Nobody says network. Likewise, nobody says sea meaning city, or war meaning water. In the very broadest Cockney, it can get reduced to a kind of creek, glottal creek, sea, wow. But there's still, I think, enough there to recognise it as a T sound. Interestingly, the only environment in which it never happens, as far as I can see, is after fricatives, or perhaps more generally after odd strings. So in a word like west, nobody would ever say west. Or left, can't become left. Perhaps that's got something to do with the acoustics. You couldn't hear it in that position so easily. Okay, so that's T-glottal. If we put T-glottal together with vocalized L, what do you boil water in when you want to make tea? Kettle. What does kettle become in Cockney? I think what's going to happen to it? Kettle. You have to stop at all. Kettle. Yod is the alpha semivowel, and in various environments it gets dropped or coalesced. Now, I know that Americans tend to say tune where we say tune, and duke where we say duke. So do people in East Anglia, Norfolk and so on, but nothing has been changing. Nowadays they seem to have taken the innovation from Kent instead of from Norfolk, and like most other parts of the country, in fact, they're moving towards ch and ch. So rather than traditional tune, you get chew. Rather than duke, you get juke. The days of the week go Monday, Tuesday, just like choose when you choose something, when you select something, Tuesday. To reduce something sounds just like juice, orange juice. Reduce. And this is certainly well established in estuary English, or rather estuary English. Not therefore estuary, estuary. Of course, even in received pronunciation, we've got a fluid situation, what Daniel Jones called perpetual, most people nowadays call perpetual. After N, new, Americans tend to drop the y and say new, so do Londoners. So you get new, and the 9 o'clock news for Londoners as you do for Americans. Neutral, what does neutral mean? Neutral. But I suppose it's really the diphthong shift that caused the greatest problems for people understanding Londoners. And most of the long vowels and diphthongs have different qualities in London. So if we're using these words as standing for hundreds of thousands of other examples, face, that's the A vowel, in London becomes I. So rather than face, you have face. Face. Want to imitate it? Face. 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 Name becomes nine. Nine. So what's your name? What's your nine? What's your nine? What's your nine? What's your nine? I, as in price, in turn becomes I, price, price, which may have some different in price, but doesn't have to, price, price. So a nice time becomes a nice time. Try nice time. That's nice. That's nice. That's nice. That's nice. That's nice. And the I of choice moves round as a closer starting point forward. Choice. Next line. O and R have different starting points. For London O, you start with R. So O no. Oh, I'll go. I will go. The owl diphthong in estuary English starts with A, so it's owl, out loud, downtown. In Cockney, it just tends to be a long A, out loud, downtown. So the Cockney is selling you half a pound of something, we call it half a pound. Half a pound. H dropping, notice the difference, the half and half, and the half a pound. Try half a pound, 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 half a pound of apples. What's the Cockney for mouth, in fact? Well, we've got a. What else did I tell you about? F. So we get mouth, mouth, mouth. E and U tend to be a bit diphthongal with an on-line of so instead of E you have E, and instead of U. So counting, we go 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Notice the application of so. That's difficult at the beginning of the syllable. So 1, 2, 2, 3. 3. 4, 4, 5, 6, much the same. 7, much the same. I shifted diphthong, no stop. I, 9, 10. 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is a foreign accent for me. I come from the north of England, I've had to learn to do it. And that's what it sounds like. The vowel for, the or, tends to split in London into two different varieties depending on environment. If it's before a consonant, then it tends towards O, or in estuary does or. So we get Cockney long, morning, bold, estuary long, morning, bold. But if it's final, we get or, estuary or. So lower, law, score, score, and board, on board. Now notice that interesting last pair. We have a difference for Londoners between board, you write on, and board, and you're fed up. Of course, they're identical. For people like me, I say board the same way, board. But it's something of a good diagnostic test for Londoners to ask people if those two words sound the same or different. Londoners will usually tell you they're different. Though, depending on how educated they are, they may sound much the same, or for a strong Cockney, sound pretty different. The maximum difference is something like bold and board. There's another split with the O vowel. Usually it's always O, but before historical dark L, we get O. And we notice this with words like told, past tense of tell. I told you, told, O, rather than O plus O, you get O for the whole thing. I told you. Gold, that's gold. And there's a complicated morphological business here, but when you have a suffix attached to one of these words, you tend to retain the old quality. So a football match has got the goal at each end, you score a goal, and the chap who stands there protecting the goal mouth is therefore called not the goalie, but the goalie. Goalie. And that means that goalie in London doesn't rhyme with slowly, where the L is in a different syllable. For me, of course, goalie, slowly, rhyme perfectly. But for Londoners, they don't, goalie, slowly. That's the kind of difference. Again, people aren't always very consistent about this, but that's the kind of difference you tend to get in London. This is a rule of Cockney, etc., which I discovered sometime after I finished writing Accents of English, so this isn't in any book. You're here really at the cutting edge of research, this is what it presented to you. And there seems to be a rule in London that says you can delete schwa, drop it, leave it out, after a glottal stop, before a consonant. So for you've got to be joking, you've got to be joking. Well now, all kinds of English have a rule reducing two T's to one in got to becomes gotta in front of the joking. But in London, if you choose to make it a glottal stop, gotta be joking, then you can drop the schwa, giving you've got me joking. You've got me joking. And similarly, the time can be quarter past, drop the stop, quarter past, drop the schwa, quarter past 3, quarter past 3. This does seem to be a pretty productive rule, but it's an absolute requirement that you use a glottal stop for the T. Once you go to a more careful T, a tongue-tip T, then the schwa has to be used. Right, well, that's it. Thanks very much.